Sometimes a man's greatest strength becomes his greatest weakness when he has something precious to lose. Even the mightiest warrior can find himself trembling when faced with a choice that could cost him everything he holds dear. In 9th century Norway, Ulfar the Thunder-Born was known across the land as a giant among men, standing 7 feet tall with a reputation forged in countless battles. But tonight he faced his most dangerous moment yet. His inheritance had been stolen during his exile. A forced marriage threatened to destroy his clan's future. Accusations of cowardice echoed through the great hall as enemies circled like wolves. Desperate, Ulfar turned to Kara Sigvaldsdóttir, the sharp-tongued widow who feared no man. His whispered request was simple: "Pretend you're my wife." Her response would change everything. What could make the most fearless warrior in Norway agree to a condition that terrified him more than any battlefield? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the fjord settlement of Ravenshollow like a blade cutting through darkness, casting long shadows across the wooden longhouses that hugged the rocky shoreline. The morning mist rose from the dark waters, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the promise of another day's struggles in this harsh but beautiful land. Smoke curled from cooking fires as the settlement stirred to life, and the sound of hammers on anvils rang out from the blacksmith's forge. Kara Sigvaldsdóttir stood at the doorway of her trading post, watching the familiar rhythm of morning unfold. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to navigate life's storms alone. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver threads, was braided in the practical style of a working woman, and her green eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her late husband's trading business flourish even after his death 3 years prior. The ornate drinking horn that sat prominently on her counter, carved with ravens and inlaid with silver, had once belonged to the most respected family in Ravenshollow. The Raven's Head drinking horn had been passed down through generations of clan leaders, but now it sat in her shop, a testament to how far the mighty could fall. She had acquired it 2 years ago when Ulfar's cousin Ragnar had sold it to pay debts, claiming it was his by right as the new clan leader. The sight of it always stirred something uncomfortable in her chest, a reminder of injustice that seemed to permeate their settlement like morning fog. Kara had learned to read people the way sailors read the wind and waves. In her years of trading, she had developed an eye for truth and deception that served her well in negotiations and kept her alive in a world where a woman alone was often seen as easy prey. She had turned down 3 marriage proposals since her husband Bjorn's death, each time politely but firmly, earning her a reputation for being proud and difficult. The truth was simpler. She had loved once, completely and truly, and the thought of settling for less felt like a betrayal of that memory. The settlement of Ravenshollow had been built in the curve of a natural harbour, protected from the worst storms by high cliffs that rose like ancient sentinels on either side. The great hall of Chieftain Thormund dominated the centre of the settlement, its high roof and carved dragon heads proclaiming the power and status of its owner. Around it, smaller buildings clustered like children seeking protection from a parent: the blacksmith's forge, the weaver's workshop, several merchant stalls, and the homes of the more prosperous families. Beyond these lay the simple dwellings of farmers, fishermen and craftsmen, their thatched roofs and modest gardens speaking of honest work and modest ambitions. The whole settlement could house perhaps 300 souls when fully occupied, though the recent troubles had driven some families to seek safer harbours elsewhere. The morning air carried the sounds of normal life: children playing, women calling to each other across garden fences, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay currents of tension that had been building for 3 years, ever since the night Ulfar Eriksson had been branded a coward and driven into exile. Kara remembered that night well. She had been in the great hall, having delivered a shipment of fine wool to Chieftain Thormund's household. When the survivors of the disastrous raid on the Frisian coast had returned with their devastating news, they spoke of a battle gone wrong, of Ulfar abandoning his men to save his own skin when the enemy counterattacked. The witnesses seemed credible, their wounds real, their grief for the fallen unmistakable. But something in their telling had struck Kara as rehearsed, too neat in its narrative. She had watched Ulfar's face as the accusations flew, seeing not guilt but bewildered shock, as if he could not comprehend how his actions had been so misunderstood. In the 3 years since, Ragnar had consolidated power as the new clan leader, making alliances and decisions that benefited his own circle while gradually eroding the prosperity that Ulfar's father had built over decades. The Raven's head, drinking horn in her shop, was just one symbol of how the family's wealth and influence had been systematically stripped away, sold off piece by piece to pay for Ragnar's increasingly expensive lifestyle and political maneuvering. The other traders whispered about Ragnar's new connections with foreign merchants, deals that seemed to favor outsiders over the clan's traditional partners. There were rumors of Christian missionaries being given unusual access to the settlement and of secret meetings held in the early hours before dawn. Kara kept her own counsel about these matters, but her merchant's instincts told her that something fundamental was shifting in the balance of power. And not for the better. As the morning progressed, a commotion at the harbour drew her attention. A longship was approaching, its red and black sail bearing a design she recognized with a start of surprise. The Thunder-Born banner had not been seen in these waters for 3 long years, and its return sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the settlement, like a stone dropped in still water. Word spread quickly through Ravenshollow that Ulfar had returned. Some welcomed the news with barely concealed satisfaction. There had always been those who doubted the accusations against him. Others seemed worried, particularly those who had prospered under Ragnar's leadership or who had spoken too freely against the exiled warrior in his absence. Kara found herself curious about what had driven him to return now, and what he hoped to accomplish in a place where his very presence would reopen old wounds. She had always found Ulfar intriguing, even before his exile. He possessed an unusual combination of fierce warrior skill and thoughtful intelligence that set him apart from many of his peers. Where other young men boasted loudly of their exploits, Ulfar had listened more than he spoke, observing the world around him with eyes that seemed to see deeper truths. His reputation on the battlefield was legendary, hence the name Thunder-Born, earned when he had fought through a violent storm to rescue a village from raiders, moving through the chaos like a force of nature itself. But it was his character in peacetime that had impressed her most. She had seen him settle disputes with fairness rather than force, show kindness to children and elderly members of the clan, and demonstrate a loyalty to family and tradition that seemed absolute. When the accusations of cowardice had surfaced, they had struck her as fundamentally inconsistent with everything she knew about him. As the longship drew closer to shore, Kara could make out the tall figure standing at its prow. Even at a distance, Ulfar's imposing stature was unmistakable. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms like tree trunks, he was a giant among men. His long blonde hair whipped in the wind, and even from her position at the trading post, she could sense the determined set of his jaw and the way his hand rested on the pommel of his sword. The ship's crew worked efficiently to bring their vessel alongside the wooden pier, their movements speaking of long familiarity with their captain and confidence in his leadership. These were not the actions of men who doubted their leader's courage. Whatever had happened on that Frisian beach 3 years ago, it had not shaken the loyalty of those who knew Ulfar best. As the gangplank was lowered and Ulfar stepped onto the pier, Kara noticed the way conversations stopped and heads turned throughout the settlement. Some faces showed welcome, others suspicion, and still others calculation, as people wondered what this return might mean for their own positions and prospects. The political landscape of Ravenshollow was about to shift again, and everyone knew it. Ulfar wore a weather-beaten cloak over his traveling clothes, the fabric bearing the scars and stains of distant battles and long journeys. The cloak had once been rich blue wool, but time and hardship had faded it to a muted grey blue that spoke of pragmatism over display. It covered broad shoulders that had carried the weight of leadership and loss, and as he moved through the settlement toward the great hall, there was something in his bearing that suggested a man, returning not as a supplicant but as someone prepared to reclaim what was rightfully his, the morning's ordinary. Rhythms were forgotten as people emerged from their homes and workshops to watch the procession. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, having heard stories of the giant warrior but never seen him in person. Older residents nodded respectfully, remembering the prosperity and security they had enjoyed under his father's leadership and hoping that the son might restore what had been lost. But there were other faces in the crowd, harder and more calculating, belonging to those who had risen in Ragnar's service or who had benefited from the changes in leadership. For them, Ulfar's return represented not hope but threat, a challenge to the new order they had worked to establish. The tension was palpable, like the charged air before a thunderstorm, as Ulfar disappeared into the great hall for what would undoubtedly be a tense reunion with Chieftain Thormund and Ragnar. Kara returned to her work, but found her thoughts repeatedly drawn to the implications of his return. Something told her that the careful balance she'd maintained in her quiet life was about to be disrupted, though she could not yet imagine how profoundly this day would change everything she thought she knew about her future. The great hall of Chieftain Thormund filled with tension as thick as smoke from the central fire pit. By evening, word had spread through every corner of Raven's Hollow that Ulfar had returned, and the settlement's most important families had gathered for what everyone knew would be a confrontation that had been 3 years in the making. The massive wooden beams overhead seemed to groan under the weight of accumulated grievances and unspoken accusations. Kara had not planned to attend the evening feast, preferring the quiet of her own hearth to the political maneuvering that such gatherings inevitably produced. But curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she found herself seated near the back of the hall, close enough to observe but far enough from the high table to avoid unwanted attention. The bench beneath her was worn smooth by generations of use, and she could feel the history of countless such gatherings in the ancient wood. The hall's walls were decorated with weapons and banners from past victories, their faded colors telling stories of honor and courage that seemed to mock the current state of affairs. Shields, bearing the ravens and wolves of various family crests, hung between iron sconces that cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, ale, and the underlying tension that came when old enemies were forced to share the same space. Chieftain Thormund sat at the high table like a man trying to balance on a knife's edge. In his 60s now, with grey threading through his once golden beard, he had ruled Raven's Hollow through careful diplomacy and strategic marriages for nearly 20 years. His daughter Astrid sat beside him, a beautiful young woman of 19 whose pale blonde hair and blue eyes made her the prize of many men's ambitions. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, adorned with silver brooches, every inch the proper chieftain's daughter. But Kara noticed how her eyes kept darting nervously between her father and the men who would shape her fate. Ragnar occupied the seat that had once belonged to Ulfar's father, his presence there a constant reminder of how power had shifted in the clan. Shorter than his cousin but powerfully built, with dark hair and calculating eyes, Ragnar had the look of a man who planned every move 3 steps ahead. He wore rich furs and gold arm rings that spoke of prosperity, but there was something in his manner that had always struck Kara as slightly desperate, as if he feared that what he had gained might slip away at any moment. When Ulfar entered the hall, the conversation died like a candle snuffed by wind. He had changed from his travel clothes into a simple but well-made tunic of dark green wool, with leather braces on his forearms and his father's silver arm ring gleaming on his left arm. The battle-worn cloak he had worn that morning was replaced by a newer one of deep blue, But Kara could see that his choice was deliberate. The colors and cut marked him clearly as a member of the ruling family, a quiet assertion of his rightful place. He moved through the hall with the confident stride of a man who belonged there, nodding to old friends and acknowledging former allies with the dignity of someone who had never truly accepted his exile as permanent. When he reached the high table, the silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. "Uncle," Ulfar said, inclining his head respectfully to Thormund, "I thank you for your hospitality." "Nephew," the chieftain replied carefully, "you have been gone a long time." "Long enough to see the world beyond our fjords," Ulfar replied. "Long enough to learn much about loyalty, honor, and the true price of both." Ragnar leaned forward, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet hall. "And what have you learned about cowardice, cousin? About abandoning your sworn brothers when they needed you most?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Kara watched Ulfar's face, seeing the muscle in his jaw tighten, but his expression remained controlled. This was the moment she had been waiting for. How would he respond to the accusations that had driven him into exile? "I learned that sometimes the truth is the first casualty in any battle," Ulfar said quietly, "and that some men will sacrifice honor for advantage, even if it means condemning the innocent." Before Ragnar could respond, Chieftain Thormund raised his hand for silence. "These are old wounds," he said firmly. "Tonight we feast. Tomorrow we can discuss the past and what it means for the future." But even as the hall gradually returned to the business of eating and drinking, the undercurrents of conflict remained. Kara observed the careful dance of allegiances as people chose their seats and their conversations. Some made a point of speaking with Ulfar, welcoming him back with varying degrees of warmth. Others studiously avoided him, their loyalty to Ragnar clear in their deliberate snubs. As the evening progressed and the ale flowed more freely, tongues loosened and old grievances surfaced. The story of the Frisian raid was retold in whispers, with different versions emerging depending on who was speaking. Some maintained that Ulfar had fled when the battle turned against them, leaving his men to die. Others suggested that he had been pursuing flanking enemies and returned to find his comrades already fallen. The truth seemed to shift like smoke, impossible to grasp. It was near midnight when Chieftain Thormund rose from his seat, the hall quieting as all eyes turned to him. His face was grave, and Kara felt her stomach tighten with the premonition that whatever he was about to announce would change everything. "My friends," Thormund began, his voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions, "these are troubled times for our clan. We face challenges from neighboring settlements, pressure from Christian missionaries, and uncertainty about our future prosperity. In such times, unity is not just desirable, it is essential for survival." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Therefore, I have made a decision that will strengthen our clan and secure our future. My daughter Astrid will marry Ulfar Eriksson, binding together the bloodlines that have led our people for generations." The announcement hit the hall like a thunderclap. Astrid's face went pale, her hand gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles showed white. Ulfar's expression remained carefully neutral, but Kara could see the tension in his shoulders. Most surprising of all was Ragnar's reaction. Instead of anger or disappointment, his face showed what looked almost like satisfaction, as if this announcement played perfectly into some larger plan. "The marriage will take place in 1 month's time," Thormund continued. "The union will bring together Astrid's inheritance of the eastern farmlands with Ulfar's rightful claim to the western territories, creating a power base that will ensure our clan's dominance in the region." But before anyone could fully process this announcement, Ragnar stood slowly, a rolled parchment in his hand. The smile on his face was cold and calculated, and Kara felt a chill of foreboding as he unrolled what appeared to be an official document. "Uncle," Ragnar said, his voice carrying false regret, "I fear there may be complications with this generous offer." He held up the parchment, and Kara could see the dark stains that marked it, blood used to seal the most binding of legal documents. This is a marriage contract witnessed and sealed according to ancient law. It binds Astrid to marry the rightful heir to the clan leadership. The hall erupted in confused murmurs as people tried to understand what Ragnar was implying. Thormund's face darkened with anger, but Ragnar continued before he could speak. As you all know, Ulfar was declared dead to the clan when he fled the battlefield 3 years ago. His inheritance passed to me as the next male heir. Therefore this contract binds Astrid to me, not to a man who has no legal standing in the clan. The gasps and angry shouts that followed were immediate and intense. Ulfar's face went white with rage, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt before stopping himself. Astrid looked stricken, trapped between her father's political needs and legal bonds that seemed to offer no escape. Furthermore, Ragnar continued, raising his voice over the noise, I have witnesses here tonight who can attest that Ulfar's exile was just and necessary. His cowardice cost the lives of good men, and his return threatens the stability we have worked so hard to achieve. 3 men stepped forward from the crowd, their faces grim but determined. Kara recognized them as survivors of the Frisian raid, men who had returned with the original accusations against Ulfar. Their presence here, ready to testify again, suggested that this entire evening had been orchestrated by Ragnar from the beginning. The choice is simple, Ragnar concluded, his eyes fixed on Ulfar with unmistakable triumph. Accept your exile with honor, or face trial for cowardice before the assembled clan. But understand this, you have no claim to lands, title, or bride. That ship sailed 3 years ago when you chose your own life over your sworn duty. The silence that followed was deafening. Ulfar stood frozen, trapped between impossible choices, his dreams of reclaiming his birthright crumbling before his eyes. It was in that moment of complete desperation, when all seemed lost and his enemies circled like wolves scenting blood, that his gaze fell upon Kara Sigvaldsdóttir. She sat in the shadows at the back of the hall, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched the drama unfold. Something in her steady gaze, neither pity nor judgment but perhaps understanding, made him take a step toward her. The conversations around them faded to background noise as their eyes met across the crowded hall, and in that moment, an idea born of desperation began to form in Ulfar's mind. The great hall seemed to hold its breath as Ulfar moved through the crowd toward Kara, his massive frame cutting through the assembled clan members like a ship through troubled waters. Every eye followed his progress, confusion and curiosity rippling through the gathering, as they tried to understand what the fallen heir could possibly want with the solitary widow who kept to herself and her trading business. Kara felt her heart quicken as he approached. Though she kept her expression carefully neutral, she had seen desperation before in her years of trading. Men backed into corners, often made choices that defied all logic and expectation. But there was something different in Ulfar's eyes as he drew near, a combination of resolve and vulnerability that spoke of a man about to risk everything on a single, impossible gamble. When he reached her table, Ulfar knelt beside her bench, bringing his towering height down to her level. The gesture was both respectful and intimate, creating a bubble of privacy in the crowded hall. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper meant for her ears alone. Kara Sigvaldsdóttir, he said, his words careful and precise. I find myself in need of a wife. The simple statement carried such weight that Kara felt the world shift around her. She studied his face in the flickering firelight, seeing the desperate sincerity there. The way his jaw was set with determination, even as his eyes betrayed the fear of rejection. And I find myself disinclined to marry, she replied quietly, matching his direct approach with her own honesty. Particularly to a man who has nothing to offer but trouble. A ghost of a smile touched his lips at her bluntness. I cannot argue with your assessment, but I can offer you something perhaps more valuable than wealth or status, the truth, and a chance to help prevent an injustice that will harm more than just myself. Kara glanced past him toward the high table. where Ragnar was watching their interaction with growing suspicion, and Astrid sat pale and silent beside her father. The political implications were becoming clear to her merchant's mind. If Ulfar could produce a wife, it would complicate Ragnar's legal maneuvering considerably. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Pretend to be my wife," Ulfar said, his voice so low that even those straining to hear could catch only fragments. "Stand with me before the clan and claim that we were wed in private before my return. By law, it would invalidate Ragnar's contract and restore my standing." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Kara felt a mixture of admiration and alarm at the sheer boldness of it. "And what makes you think I would agree to such a deception?" Ulfar was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands before returning to meet her eyes. "Because I believe you are a woman who values justice over convenience. Because you have seen how Ragnar's leadership has affected this settlement, and you know it will only get worse. And because," he hesitated, then continued with raw honesty, "because I have nowhere else to turn, and you are the only person in this hall I trust to understand what honor truly means." His words struck deeper than she had expected. Kara had indeed watched the settlement's slow decline under Ragnar's rule, seen the way fear and suspicion had replaced the prosperity and security she remembered from earlier years. More than that, she recognized something in Ulfar's desperation that echoed her own experience of loss and the need to rebuild from ashes. "If I were to agree to such madness," she said carefully, "what would you expect from such an arrangement?" "Nothing beyond the pretense itself," Ulfar replied immediately. "You would retain your independence, your property, your right to make your own choices. I ask only for the appearance of marriage, not the reality." It was then that Kara made a decision that surprised even herself. Perhaps it was the memory of her late husband's stories about Ulfar's father, a man of genuine honor in a world increasingly short of such qualities. Perhaps it was her own merchant's instinct that Ragnar's continued rule would be bad for business and worse for the settlement's future. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes a person had to take a stand, regardless of the personal cost. "I have one condition," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to. Relief flooded Ulfar's features, followed immediately by wariness. "Name it!" Kara reached up to her left arm and slowly removed the twisted silver bracelet that had never left her wrist since her husband's death. The metal was warm from her skin, worn smooth by years of wear, and inscribed with runes that spelled out her married name. It was the most precious thing she owned, a symbol of the only true love she had ever known. "You will not lie with me unless you mean to stay," she said, holding the bracelet between them, like a sacred oath. "This is not a temporary convenience or a political arrangement to be discarded when it no longer serves your purposes. If you want me to be your wife, even in pretense, then you must understand that I will not be used and abandoned." The condition hung in the air between them, more binding than any legal contract. Ulfar stared at the silver bracelet, understanding that she was offering him not just her cooperation, but her most precious possession, and demanding in return a promise that went far beyond mere political convenience. "I understand," he said quietly, extending his arm so she could place the bracelet upon it. "And I swear by Thor's hammer and my father's memory that I will honor your condition." Kara fastened the silver band around his thick wrist, the metal looking almost delicate against his weathered skin. The gesture was witnessed by several nearby clan members, and she could see understanding dawning on their faces as they realized what was happening. "Then rise, husband," she said loud enough now for others to hear, "and let us end this farce together." Ulfar stood, offering her his hand with the courtly grace of a man born to leadership. As Kara rose beside him, she was struck by how natural it felt to stand at his side, despite the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. His presence was steadying, a calm strength that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Together, They walked toward the high table, their linked hands creating ripples of astonishment throughout the hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people tried to process this unexpected development. Some faces showed confusion, others calculation, and still others the dawning realization that the evening's political maneuvering had just taken a completely unforeseen turn. Ragnar's face had gone from triumph to suspicion to something approaching panic as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. If Ulfar was already married, it would invalidate not just the marriage contract, but potentially his entire legal argument about inheritance and clan standing. What is the meaning of this? Ragnar demanded as they approached the high table. Ulfar's voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent hall. I present to you my wife Kara Sigvaldsdóttir, wed to me in the old ways before my return to Raven's Hollow. Our marriage, witnessed by the gods and sealed with sacred vows, predates any contract you may wave about. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and chaotic. Some shouted accusations of deception. Others called for proof, and still others began debating the legal implications of competing claims. Through it all, Kara stood beside Ulfar with her chin raised and her hand steady in his, presenting a united front that neither of them had expected to feel so natural. But even as they faced the storm of controversy together, Kara could not shake the feeling that they had just set in motion forces that would test not only their fabricated marriage, but their very souls. The chaos in the great hall continued long into the night, with heated debates erupting over the legitimacy of Ulfar and Kara's claimed marriage. Some clan members demanded proof beyond their word, while others argued that the old ways of private ceremony were still valid under clan law. Through it all, Kara found herself observing her new husband with growing curiosity, noting how he handled the pressure with dignity that impressed her despite herself. When they finally escaped the hall and made their way to Kara's modest home near the trading post, the full weight of what they had done settled over them. The dwelling was comfortable, but clearly designed for one person, a main room with a cooking area, sleeping alcove, and storage space for her merchant goods. Ulfar's imposing presence made the space feel suddenly intimate. You can sleep by the fire, Kara said practically, gathering furs and blankets. I have extra bedding, and the hearth stones retain heat through the night. Ulfar nodded, understanding the necessity of maintaining proper boundaries. As he arranged his sleeping area, Kara noticed him examining the small wooden horse that sat on a shelf near her bed. The toy was clearly old, carved with loving attention and worn smooth from much handling. It belonged to my son, she said quietly. Eric, he would have been 8 years old this winter. The simple statement carried such weight of loss that Ulfar felt his chest tighten. He had known she was a widow, but not that she had lost a child as well. The knowledge shed new light on her earlier condition, making him understand that her demand for commitment came from wounds far deeper than political calculation. How did he die? Ulfar asked gently. Raiders, Kara replied, her voice steady but distant. The same attack that took my husband 3 years ago. They came in the early morning, before the settlement's defenses could be organized. Bjorn tried to get us to safety, but Eric ran back for his toy horse. By the time we realized he was missing, she trailed off, her fingers unconsciously touching the place where her silver bracelet had been. Understanding flooded through Ulfar. That was the raid where I was supposed to provide coastal protection. The one I missed because of the Frisian expedition. Kara nodded, meeting his eyes directly. Yes, if you had been here, perhaps my family would still be whole. The words weren't spoken with accusation, but Ulfar felt their weight nonetheless. Here was another consequence of the choices that had led to his exile. Another life affected by the complex web of loyalty and duty that defined their world. I cannot undo the past, he said quietly. But perhaps I can understand now why you demanded what you did. You have learned the cost of men who make promises they don't keep. I have learned that words are easy, Kara agreed. It is actions, continued over time, that reveal a person's true character. A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet conversation. Kara and Ulfar exchanged glances, both immediately alert. Visitors at this hour usually meant trouble. Kara opened the door to find Astrid standing outside, her pale face barely visible in the moonlight. The young woman looked frightened, wrapped in a dark cloak. "Lady Astrid," Kara said, surprised. "What brings you here at such an hour?" "I need to speak with you both," Astrid said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "About what Ragnar plans to do." Ulfar rose from his place by the fire, immediately alert. "What do you know of his plans?" Astrid stepped inside, and in the firelight they could see she had been crying. "He's not going to let this stand. He's already meeting with his supporters, planning to challenge your marriage in the morning. He says he has evidence to prove you're lying." Kara felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of evidence?" "I don't know exactly, but he seemed very confident. He also said something about making sure that even if your marriage is real, it won't matter by the time he's finished." The threat hung heavy in the small room. Ulfar moved closer to the door, his hand checking his sword's position. "There's something else," Astrid continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I overheard Ragnar talking with some foreigners I didn't recognize. They were speaking about payments and schedules, and something about the final phase beginning soon." Kara and Ulfar exchanged meaningful looks. The rumors about Ragnar's foreign connections suddenly seemed more ominous. "Why are you telling us this?" Ulfar asked gently. "You're putting yourself at risk." Astrid straightened, showing the strength beneath her frightened exterior. "Because I don't want to marry a man who traffics with enemies of our people. Because I've seen how the settlement has changed under Ragnar's rule. And because I believe in justice, even when it's inconvenient." Her courage reminded Kara of her own decision that evening. Sometimes the most important choices required acting against immediate interests for something larger. When Astrid finally left, Kara and Ulfar were alone, with the knowledge that their desperate gamble had only bought them time. Ragnar was planning his counterattack. "I'm sorry," Ulfar said quietly. "I've dragged you into something more dangerous than either of us imagined." Kara looked at him across the small room, seeing not the legendary warrior or desperate exile, but simply a man trying to do right in a world that seemed to punish honor. "Perhaps," she replied, "but I made my choice with open eyes, and despite everything, I find I don't regret it." The next morning brought grey skies and a cold wind off the fjord that seemed to carry the scent of approaching storms. Kara woke before dawn to find Ulfar already up, standing by the window and watching the settlement stir to life. His profile was etched with worry, and she could see the weight of their precarious situation in the set of his shoulders. "You didn't sleep well," she observed, rising from her bed and beginning to prepare the morning meal. "Sleep has been a luxury I've learned to do without," Ulfar replied, turning from the window. "Last night I kept thinking about what Astrid told us. If Ragnar truly has foreign allies, then this conspiracy goes far deeper than personal ambition." Kara nodded, her merchant's mind already turning over the implications. "The trading routes have been shifting over the past year. Merchants I've dealt with for years have suddenly found better offers elsewhere, often from traders I don't recognize. If someone is deliberately undermining our economic foundation, then they're preparing for something much larger than simply stealing my inheritance." Ulfar finished grimly. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, more confident than Astrid's tentative tap of the night before. Ulfar moved to answer it, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt as he opened the door to reveal an elderly woman wrapped in a thick woolen cloak. "Aunt Sigrid," Ulfar said with surprise and genuine pleasure, stepping aside to welcome her in. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." Sigrid Thorsdóttir was Ulfar's father's sister, a woman of 60 years whose sharp eyes and silver hair commanded respect throughout the settlement. She had been the clan's most trusted advisor before Ragnar's rise to power, and her withdrawal from public life had been seen by many as a sign of her disapproval of the new leadership. "I bring you something that has been waiting 3 years for your return," she said, without preamble, pulling a heavy bundle from beneath her cloak. As she unwrapped it, Kara gasped at what was revealed. Heavy iron shackles, their surface stained with what could only be old blood. These were found in the ruins of your family's hall, Sigrid continued, her voice heavy with old grief. Hidden beneath the floor stones where your father died. They tell a story that Ragnar would prefer remained buried. Ulfar took the shackles with reverent hands, his face pale as he examined the cruel metal. Father was tortured before he died. For 3 days, Sigrid confirmed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I have kept these hidden, along with other evidence that proves your father discovered something that cost him his life. Something that threatened not just his position, but the very survival of our clan. Kara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of evidence? Sigrid glanced toward the door, then moved closer to speak in low tones. Documents in your father's hand, detailing meetings with strangers who spoke of gold in exchange for access to our harbors. Names of clan members who had been approached with offers of wealth and position if they would support a change in leadership. And most damning of all, correspondence that proves Ragnar was already negotiating with foreign powers before your father's death. The implications hit Ulfar like a physical blow. The raid on our settlement 3 years ago, the one where Kara lost her family, it wasn't random, was it? I believe it was a test, Sigrid said sadly. A way to measure our defenses and see how we would respond to attack. Your absence made it the perfect opportunity to assess our vulnerabilities. Kara sank onto a bench, her mind reeling as pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. The traders who stopped coming, the new merchants with better offers. They were gathering information about our resources and trade routes. And now they're ready for the final phase, Ulfar said, remembering Astrid's warning. But what could they possibly want with Ravenshollow? We're prosperous, but hardly the wealthiest settlement in the region. Sigrid moved to the window, pointing toward the harbor where several ships rode at anchor. Location, nephew. We control one of the finest natural harbors on this coast, with easy access to both the inland river routes and the open sea. For raiders or invaders looking to establish a permanent foothold in Norse territory, we would be invaluable. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Kara found herself thinking of her late husband, who had been killed defending their home from what they had assumed was a simple raid. To learn that his death had been part of a larger plan, a calculated sacrifice in someone else's game of power, filled her with a cold fury she had never experienced before. We need proof that will stand up before the clan assembly, Ulfar said, his voice steady despite the rage Kara could see building in his eyes. Accusations alone won't be enough, especially coming from an exile and a woman who claims to be his wife. The proof exists, Sigrid assured him, but it's hidden where Ragnar will never think to look for it. Your father was wise enough to know that if he was discovered, he would not survive to reveal what he had learned. So he entrusted the evidence to someone Ragnar would never suspect. She paused, looking directly at Kara. He gave it to your husband, child. Bjorn was one of the few men your father trusted completely, and as a merchant, he had reason to travel and communicate with people throughout the region. The evidence is hidden somewhere in your trading post, waiting to be found. Kara felt the world shift around her as she realized that her husband's death had not been the random tragedy she had believed. He had died protecting more than just his family. He had died keeping secrets that could save their entire clan from foreign domination. Bjorn never told me, she whispered. He must have hidden it so well that even I couldn't accidentally discover it. He was protecting you, Ulfar said gently. If you had known, you would have been in danger from the moment the conspiracy was discovered. Sigrid nodded approvingly. A wise man, your husband. But now the time for secrets has passed. If we're to stop Ragnar and his foreign allies, we must find that evidence and present it before the clan assembly. The three of them spent the next hour systematically searching Kara's trading post, looking for hidden compartments or concealed spaces where documents might be stored. Kara found herself seeing her familiar surroundings with new eyes, trying to think like her practical husband who had always been methodical. in his approach to both business and life. It was Ulfar who finally found it, a loose stone in the foundation wall behind a stack of wool bales. Behind the stone was a waterproof leather pouch containing documents that made their worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. The papers detailed not just a conspiracy to take control of Ravenshollow, but a coordinated plan to establish foreign strongholds throughout the region. Maps showing strategic harbor locations, lists of clan leaders who had been compromised or eliminated, and correspondence in multiple languages that revealed the true scope of the invasion plan. "This isn't just about our clan," Kara breathed, reading over Ulfar's shoulder. "They're planning to take control of the entire coastline, and Ragnar is their key to making it happen," Ulfar added grimly. "By the time the other clans realize what's happening, it will be too late to mount an effective resistance." Sigrid took one of the documents, her face grave as she read. "There's something else here, a timeline. According to this, the final phase was supposed to begin after Ragnar's marriage to Astrid, which would have given him legal claim to her father's lands as well as the territories he already controls. But our marriage has disrupted that timeline," Kara realized. "That's why he's so desperate to discredit us, not just to reclaim his position, but to get his entire plan back on schedule." As they studied the evidence, all three understood that they were no longer simply fighting for Ulfar's inheritance or even his honor. They were fighting for the survival of their way of life, against enemies who had been planning their destruction for years. The iron shackles lay on the table between them, a grim reminder of what happened to those who stood against this conspiracy. But they also represented something else, the determination of a man who had died rather than betray his people, and the hope that his sacrifice might yet save them all. The weight of their discovery settled over them like a burial shroud as they studied the documents spread across Kara's table. The evidence was damning beyond anything they had imagined, but presenting it would require careful strategy and perfect timing. One mistake could not only cost them their lives, but doom their entire clan to foreign domination. "We need to understand exactly who we can trust," Ulfar said, his finger tracing the list of compromised clan members. "Some of these names surprise me. Men I thought were honorable have apparently been bought with foreign gold." Kara leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she examined the documents. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through both of them, a reminder that beneath the political maneuvering and life-or-death stakes, something deeper was growing between them. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a particular letter written in Latin script. The parchment was of finer quality than the others, bearing an official seal that neither of them recognized. "This isn't from merchants or raiders. This is from someone with real authority, possibly a Christian king looking to expand his territory." Aunt Sigrid nodded grimly. "The new faith brings new masters, and they have little patience for our old ways. They see our independence as an obstacle to their expansion, our prosperity as resources to be claimed for their own use." As they worked to organize the evidence into a coherent presentation, Kara found herself increasingly aware of Ulfar's presence beside her. His hands, large enough to wield a warhammer with devastating effect, moved with surprising gentleness as he handled the delicate documents. When he spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful, showing the intelligence that had made him an effective leader before his exile. "There's something I need to tell you," Ulfar said suddenly, his eyes meeting Kara's. "About what happened during my exile, and why I came back now." Kara set down the document she was reading, giving him her complete attention. She had been curious about his years away, but had respected his privacy. Now, with danger closing around them, she sensed that understanding his past might be crucial to their survival. "I wasn't wandering aimlessly," he continued. "I spent time with other clans, learning about their struggles with foreign pressure. What's happening here isn't unique. It's part of a larger pattern of infiltration and conquest. That's how I recognized the signs when I returned, and why you felt compelled to come back despite the risks," Kara observed. "Yes, I saw what happened to settlements that fell to these tactics. The leaders were replaced with puppets, the people enslaved or driven away, and the land turned into bases for further expansion. I couldn't let that happen to Ravenshollow, to my father's legacy, to the people I grew up with. He paused, looking directly at her. To you. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any declaration of love. Kara felt her heart quicken as she realized that his return hadn't been solely about reclaiming his inheritance. It had been about protecting what mattered to him. And somehow she had become part of that. When this is over, she said quietly, when Ragnar is exposed and the threat is ended, what then? What do you truly want from this marriage we've created? Ulfar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the small wooden horse that still sat on her shelf. 3 days ago, I would have said I wanted only to reclaim what was stolen from me. But now, he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Now I find myself hoping that what began as pretense might become something real. The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through her entire body. Kara looked down at their joined hands, seeing how natural they looked together, despite the difference in size. His palm was calloused from years of sword work, but his touch was gentle, respectful of her earlier condition even as it conveyed his growing feelings. I'm frightened, she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not of the danger we face, but of this, of caring for someone again, of risking the pain of loss. I understand, Ulfar replied, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. I've seen too much death, lost too many people I cared about. The thought of adding you to that list terrifies me more than any battle I've ever faced. Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Aunt Sigrid quickly gathered the documents, while Ulfar moved to answer, his hand automatically checking his weapon, as he had done countless times over the past days. This time, it was one of Ulfar's former companions, a grizzled warrior named Thorvald, who had served with him before the exile. His face was grim, and blood stained his tunic from a fresh wound on his arm. Ulfar, he said without preamble, Ragnar knows you have allies helping you. His men attacked my farm this morning, demanding to know what I had told you. They're moving against anyone who might support your claim. How many others? Ulfar asked, immediately shifting into the tactical mindset that had made him an effective military leader. At least 5 families that I know of. They're being accused of harboring traitors and threatened with exile or worse if they don't publicly denounce you. Kara felt anger flare within her. He's forcing people to choose sides before we can present our evidence. More than that, Aunt Sigrid said, understanding the political implications immediately. He's eliminating potential witnesses and isolating you from support. By the time you're ready to make your case, you may have no one left to speak for you. The news forced them to reconsider their careful plans. They had hoped to gather more evidence and build a stronger coalition before confronting Ragnar directly. But his preemptive strikes were making that strategy impossible. We need to act sooner than planned, Ulfar decided. Tomorrow's market day, most of the clan will be gathered in the central square. If we can present our evidence then, in front of everyone at once, Ragnar won't be able to silence all the witnesses. That's incredibly dangerous, Kara protested. He'll be ready for something like that, probably with armed supporters. Then we'd better be ready too, Ulfar replied grimly. Thorvald, how many men can we count on if things turn violent? Maybe a dozen who are willing to fight openly. Perhaps twice that, if they see we have a real chance of winning. It wasn't many against the force Ragnar could muster, but it might be enough if they could turn public opinion in their favor quickly enough. As they planned their desperate gambit, Kara found herself watching Ulfar with new eyes. This was the man who had earned the name Thunder-Born, not just for his prowess in battle, but for his ability to strike decisively when the moment demanded it. The comfortable domesticity of their mourning was replaced by the sharp focus of a leader preparing for war. But when their eyes met across the table as they finalized their plans, she saw something else there, a promise that whatever happened in the coming confrontation, he would not abandon what they had begun to build together. The die was cast. Tomorrow would bring either vindication and victory, or death and defeat. But tonight, for just a few precious hours, they had each other, and the growing certainty that their pretend marriage had already become something much more real and precious than either had dared to hope. The morning of market day dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that seemed to cut through even the thickest cloaks. Kara woke to find Ulfar already dressed and standing by the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale light. Today would determine not just their fate, but the future of everyone they cared about. "Second thoughts?" she asked quietly, rising to join him at the window. "Many," he admitted, not turning from his observation of the settlement below. "But no alternatives. Ragnar has forced our hand, and waiting longer will only make our position weaker." As they prepared for what might be their final day together, both were acutely aware of how much had changed between them. The desperation that had driven their initial arrangement had transformed into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared danger, and growing love that neither had expected to find. They made their way to the market square as the sun climbed higher, carrying with them the precious documents that could either save their clan or cost them their lives. The square was already filling with people, merchants setting up their stalls, farmers bringing produce from the surrounding lands, and families conducting the business that kept their community alive. But there was tension in the air that had nothing to do with commercial competition. Groups of armed men moved through the crowd with obvious purpose, and conversation stopped when certain names were mentioned. Everyone seemed to know that today would bring a confrontation that had been building for 3 long years. Kara noticed Ragnar near the platform used by merchants to display their finest wares. He was surrounded by his supporters, their confidence evident in their relaxed postures and casual conversations. He caught sight of Ulfar and Kara across the square and smiled, the cold, calculating expression of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. "He looks very sure of himself," Kara observed, her merchant's eye reading the body language of the crowd. "More confident than a man should be who's about to face damning evidence," Ulfar nodded grimly. "He's planning something. The question is what?" Their answer came sooner than expected. As they moved toward the center of the square, where they planned to make their presentation, a commotion erupted near the harbor. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew everyone's attention as a group of men came racing up from the docks. "Ships!" one of them called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Foreign ships approaching the harbor, at least a dozen, flying banners we don't recognize." The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. People began talking urgently among themselves, parents gathering their children closer, and merchants eyeing their goods with concern. But what struck Kara as odd was Ragnar's reaction. Instead of alarm or surprise, his face showed what looked almost like satisfaction. "The timing is convenient," Ulfar murmured, his warrior's instincts immediately suspicious. "Foreign ships arrive just as we're about to expose his foreign connections." Before they could act on their suspicions, another voice cut through the crowd, elderly and commanding, carrying the authority of age and wisdom. Aunt Sigrid stepped onto the merchant's platform, and her presence immediately commanded attention. In her hands, she carried something that made several people in the crowd gasp with recognition. It was a crown of raven feathers, ancient and ceremonial, bound with silver wire and set with small gems that caught the morning light. The raven feather crown had belonged to the clan's seers for generations, worn only during the most sacred and important pronouncements. The sight of it being brought out in broad daylight in the market square sent ripples of awe and concern through the assembled people. "Hear me, O people of Raven's Hollow," Sigrid called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I come before you wearing the crown of prophecy, as my grandmother did, and her grandmother before her. The spirits of our ancestors have spoken, and their words must be heard." The crowd fell silent, even the most skeptical understanding that what was happening went beyond normal political maneuvering. The old ways commanded respect, and Sigrid's reputation as a seer was unquestioned even by those who disagreed with her politics. 3 years ago, she continued, I spoke a prophecy that many dismissed as the ravings of an old woman grieving for her dead brother. But today, as foreign ships approach our shores and treachery reveals itself, those words prove true." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. "I said that a false marriage would become true salvation, that the exiled would return to save the clan from those who would destroy it from within, and that the truth would be revealed when ravens flew with foreign hawks." Kara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. She had heard rumors of the prophecy, but had dismissed them as political maneuvering disguised as religious pronouncement. Now, seeing the crown on Sigrid's head and hearing the words in context, she realized there had been layers of meaning she hadn't understood. "The false marriage," Sigrid declared, pointing directly at Ulfar and Kara, "stands before you. Born of desperation but blessed by the gods, it has already begun to save us from the treachery that surrounds us." Ragnar stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. "This is superstitious nonsense. You cannot use old stories to—" "Can I not?" Sigrid interrupted, her eyes flashing with an authority that made even Ragnar step back. "Then explain the foreign ships that arrive so conveniently just as questions about your loyalty arise. Explain why merchants loyal to you seem to know exactly what goods will be needed and when. Explain why your rise to power has coincided so perfectly with the weakening of our traditional alliances." The crowd was murmuring now, people putting together pieces they hadn't seen before. Kara realized that Sigrid wasn't just making accusations. She was using the prophecy as a framework to help people understand the evidence they were about to present. But Ragnar wasn't finished. With a gesture to his supporters, he called out in a voice designed to carry across the square, "I tire of these riddles and accusations. If Ulfar believes he has a rightful claim to leadership, let him prove it in the traditional way. I challenge him to single combat, here and now, before all our people." The challenge sent a shock through the crowd. Single combat was an ancient right, one that could settle disputes when other methods failed. But it also meant that all their carefully gathered evidence might be meaningless if Ulfar fell to Ragnar's blade. "I accept," Ulfar called out without hesitation, though Kara could see the calculation behind his quick response. He understood, as she did, that refusing would make him look weak and undermine everything they were trying to accomplish. But Sigrid wasn't finished with her revelations. As the crowd began to form the traditional circle for combat, she raised her voice once more. "Before blood is shed," she declared, "let all know the full truth of what we face. The evidence we have gathered proves beyond doubt that Ragnar has been in communication with foreign powers, planning not just to take control of our clan, but to deliver us into the hands of our enemies." She gestured to Kara, who stepped forward with the documents they had discovered. "The proof lies here. Correspondence, payments, maps, and plans that show the full scope of the conspiracy. Ragnar has not been building alliances, he has been preparing our conquest." The impact of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. Some of Ragnar's supporters looked genuinely shocked, clearly unaware of the full extent of his plans. Others shifted nervously, perhaps wondering if they had chosen the wrong side, but the most telling reaction came from the harbor, where horns began to sound, the signal that the approaching ships were indeed hostile. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and suddenly Sigrid's prophecy about ravens flying with foreign hawks took on a terrifyingly literal meaning. "The ships!" someone called out. "They're moving into attack formation." Ragnar's face went white as he realized that his foreign allies had arrived too early, before he had consolidated control of the settlement. The careful timing of his plan was falling apart, and with it, any pretense that he was acting in the clan's best interests. "This changes nothing," he snarled, drawing his sword. "Combat will decide who leads, and when I am victorious, I will deal with these ships as I see fit." But as Ulfar drew his own blade, and the two men faced each other in the hastily formed circle, everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than a personal dispute. The outcome of this fight would determine whether Ravenshollow remained free or fell to foreign domination. whether their ancient ways would survive or be swept away by the tide of conquest that was even now approaching their shores. The raven feather crown caught the light as Sigrid raised her arms, and her voice carried across the square with the weight of prophecy and desperate hope. "Let the gods decide," she called out. "Let truth and courage triumph over treachery and greed. Let the Thunder-Born prove worthy of his name when his people need him most." The circle formed around Ulfar, and Ragnar expanded as people pressed back to give the combatants room. But their attention was divided between the impending fight and the growing threat from the harbour. The foreign ships had moved into clear attack formation, their dark hulls cutting through the water with ominous purpose. War horns sounded from the settlement's watchtowers, calling every able-bodied defender to arms. Kara found herself caught between terror and admiration as she watched Ulfar prepare for battle. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had faced death countless times, checking his weapons and armor with practiced efficiency. But she could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. He knew that this fight was about far more than personal honor or clan leadership. From a leather scabbard at his side, Ulfar drew forth a weapon that sent a murmur of recognition through the crowd. The thunder hammer was legendary throughout the region, a war hammer inscribed with protective runes by his father's own hand, its steel head bearing the scars of 100 battles. The sight of it in his hands seemed to restore confidence to those who had begun to doubt, a tangible reminder of the strength and honor that the name Thunder-Born represented. "My father forged this hammer with his own hands," Ulfar called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "He inscribed it with runes of protection and victory, blessing it with the strength of our ancestors. Today it will serve justice once more." Ragnar had drawn his own sword, a fine blade, but one that seemed somehow diminished next to the legendary hammer. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with the desperation of a man who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the exposure of his treachery to all who had trusted him. "Words and legends," Ragnar sneered, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "Let us see how your father's blessing serves you against cold steel and living strength." As the two men began to circle each other, Aunt Sigrid approached Kara, the raven feather crown still upon her head, but her eyes focused on the immediate danger rather than mystical prophecies. "There's something you need to know," she said quietly. Her words meant for Kara alone. "Something that will matter greatly in the moments to come." Kara tore her attention away from the circling warriors, seeing urgency in the older woman's expression that went beyond concern for the combat's outcome. "The prophecy speaks of more than just the marriage and the battle," Sigrid continued. "It tells of a choice that the false wife must make, a choice between safety and sacrifice that will determine whether the thunder truly returns to protect our people." "What kind of choice?" Kara asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "When the moment comes, you will understand," Sigrid replied cryptically. "But know this, the gods rarely offer victory without demanding a price, and sometimes that price must be paid by those we least expect to bear it." Before Kara could ask for clarification, the sound of steel meeting steel rang out across the square. Ulfar and Ragnar had closed with each other, their weapons clashing in a shower of sparks that drew gasps from the watching crowd. The two men were well matched in skill, but their fighting styles reflected their characters. Ulfar fought with disciplined strength and tactical thinking, while Ragnar relied on aggressive attacks and cunning opportunism. The thunder hammer's weight and reach gave Ulfar an advantage in power, but Ragnar's sword was faster and more maneuverable. They circled each other like wolves, testing defenses and looking for openings, while the crowd watched in tense silence. "You were always too honorable for your own good," Ragnar taunted as he darted in with a thrust that Ulfar barely deflected. "Your father had the same weakness. He trusted when he should have been suspicious, believed in loyalty when he should have seen treachery, and you were always too clever for your own good," Ulfar replied, his hammer sweeping in a wide arc that forced Ragnar to leap backward. So clever that you've betrayed not just me, but everyone who ever called you family." Their exchange was interrupted by shouts from the harbor. The first wave of foreign ships had reached the docks, and armed men were pouring onto the wooden piers. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder. They moved with the discipline of professional soldiers, forming ranks and advancing with shields locked and spears ready. The sight galvanized the watching crowd. Whatever the outcome of the personal combat between Ulfar and Ragnar, their settlement was under attack by a foreign army. Men ran to retrieve weapons and armor, while women gathered children and began moving toward the predetermined safe areas in the event of attack. But Ragnar seemed to take confidence from the arrival of his allies. His attacks became more aggressive, more reckless, as if he believed that he only needed to survive long enough for the foreign soldiers to secure the settlement. "You see," he called out between exchanges, "the future has already arrived. These men bring order, prosperity, and the protection of a true king. Your old ways are finished, Ulfar. Accept defeat gracefully, and I might convince them to spare your life." "I would rather die free than live as a slave," Ulfar replied, landing a solid blow with the flat of his hammer that sent Ragnar staggering. "And I think our people would agree." As if to prove his point, the sound of battle began to echo from the harbor. The settlement's defenders were engaging the invaders, and the clash of weapons mixed with shouts of defiance and pain. Some of the foreign soldiers had broken through the initial defense line and were advancing into the settlement itself. It was then that Kara understood what Sigrid had meant about a choice between safety and sacrifice. She could see the tactical situation developing. If the foreign soldiers reached the market square while Ulfar was still engaged in single combat, they could overwhelm the defenders and capture or kill the clan's rightful leader, regardless of the fight's outcome. But there was another option. The foreign advance was following the main road from the harbor, a route that would bring them directly past her trading post. If the building were to catch fire at just the right moment, it would block the road and force the invaders to take a longer route that would give the defenders precious time to organize. The choice was exactly what Sigrid had predicted: safety for herself and her property, or sacrifice for the greater good of her people. Everything she had built since her husband's death, all the security and independence she had worked so hard to achieve, would be lost if she chose to act. Kara looked at Ulfar, seeing him pressed hard by Ragnar's increasingly desperate attacks. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air, and she could see that the weight of his responsibility was affecting his concentration. He needed time, and he needed to know that the foreign advance had been delayed. "Thorvald," she called to Ulfar's loyal companion, who stood at the edge of the combat circle with his hand on his sword. "Gather what men you can and follow me. We're going to buy our defenders some time. What are you planning?" he asked. But she was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward her trading post. "Something my husband would have done," she replied, thinking of Bjorn's willingness to sacrifice for his community. "Something that needs to be done." As she ran through the settlement's winding streets, Kara could hear the battle growing closer. The foreign soldiers were professional and disciplined, but they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against people defending their homes. The outcome was far from certain, but every advantage could make the difference between freedom and conquest. She reached her trading post just as the first foreign soldiers came into view down the main road. They advanced in formation, their shields locked together and their spears projecting like a bristling fence. Behind them came archers and what looked like engineers carrying siege equipment. Without hesitation, Kara began pulling bundles of wool and bolts of cloth from her storage areas, piling them in the center of the building's main room. The materials would burn hot and fast, creating the kind of fire that would be impossible to extinguish quickly. "Are you certain about this?" Thorvald asked, as he and the men who had followed them began to understand her plan. "More certain than I've ever been about anything," Kara replied, striking flint to tinder with steady hands. "This is what it means to choose a side, to commit completely to something larger than yourself." The flames caught quickly, spreading through the dry goods with hungry intensity. Within minutes, the entire building was ablaze, and thick smoke was billowing across the main road. The foreign advance ground to a halt as soldiers coughed and struggled to see through the choking clouds. But more importantly, the fire served as a signal to the entire settlement. Every defender could see the flames and smoke, understanding that someone had made a stand, that the fight for their freedom was worth any sacrifice. As Kara watched her life's work burn, she felt not grief but a strange sense of completion. This was what Ulfar had meant when he spoke of commitment, what her condition about staying truly required. Love wasn't just about personal happiness. It was about choosing to share someone's struggles, to sacrifice for their dreams, to become part of something larger than individual desire. The sound of the thunder hammer striking Ragnar's shield echoed across the square, and Kara knew that the real battle was just beginning. But she also knew that whatever happened next, she had made her choice. She had chosen Ulfar, chosen their people, chosen to fight for a future that might be uncertain, but would at least be free. The raven feather crown caught the light of her burning trading post as Aunt Sigrid nodded approvingly. The prophecy was unfolding exactly as the gods had ordained, and the false marriage was indeed becoming the salvation of them all. The smoke from Kara's burning trading post created a wall of choking darkness that split the battlefield in two, giving the settlement's defenders precious time to organize their resistance. But in the market square, the single combat between Ulfar and Ragnar continued with deadly intensity. Both men knowing that the outcome would determine not just their personal fates, but the future of everyone they had ever known. At the heart of the square stood the ancient judgment stone, a massive boulder carved with the scales of justice that had witnessed clan disputes for countless generations. The stone bore the weight of tradition and the hope for fair resolution, its weathered surface marked by the decisions of generations past. Today, it would witness perhaps the most crucial judgment in the clan's history. Ragnar's attacks had become increasingly desperate as the sound of battle echoed from the harbor. His carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, the foreign allies arriving too early and the settlement's resistance proving stronger than expected. But he still had his skill with a blade and the knowledge that if he could just eliminate Ulfar, the clan's organized resistance would collapse. "You hear that?" Ragnar panted between sword strokes, gesturing toward the sounds of combat. "My allies are already in the settlement. Even if you kill me, you cannot stop what has already begun." Ulfar's response was the thunder hammer, sweeping in a devastating arc that shattered Ragnar's shield and sent him stumbling backward. "Perhaps not," he replied grimly, "but I can make sure you don't live to enjoy your victory." The crowd around them had thinned as people ran to join the defense of their homes. But those who remained watched with the intensity of people witnessing history unfold. Aunt Sigrid stood near the judgment stone, the raven feather crown catching the light from the distant fires as she observed the combat with eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate struggle. "The prophecy speaks of this moment," she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "It tells of a judgment that will be rendered not by words or law, but by strength and truth in mortal combat." As if responding to her words, Ulfar pressed his attack with renewed vigor. The thunder hammer sang through the air, its rune-inscribed head gleaming as it deflected Ragnar's increasingly frantic swordwork. The weapon seemed to pulse with its own life, as if the protective blessings inscribed by Ulfar's father were awakening to defend their rightful bearer. But Ragnar was not finished. With the cunning that had served him throughout his rise to power, he feinted left, then dove right, rolling past Ulfar's guard to come up behind him with his sword aimed at the giant warrior's unprotected back. The crowd gasped as Ragnar's blade swept toward Ulfar's spine. But the Thunder-Born had not earned his reputation through strength alone. He spun with liquid grace, the hammer's handle catching Ragnar's sword arm and deflecting the killing blow into a shallow cut across his shoulder. "Treachery, even in honorable combat," Ulfar observed, his voice steady despite the blood now staining his tunic. "You truly have forgotten what it means to be one of our people." "I have learned what it means to survive," Ragnar snarled. But his failed surprise attack had cost him his best opportunity. Now he faced Ulfar straight on, with no tricks left, and his enemy fully aware of his willingness to fight dishonorably. The final exchange came with shocking suddenness. Ragnar, seeing his situation growing desperate, committed everything to one last attack, a wild charge with his sword extended, hoping to overwhelm Ulfar's defenses through sheer reckless aggression. But Ulfar had been waiting for exactly such a move. He sidestepped at the last moment, bringing the Thunderhammer around in a perfectly timed stroke that caught Ragnar in the side. The sound of the impact echoed across the square like thunder itself, and Ragnar collapsed to the stones of the market square, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of battle from other parts of the settlement. Ulfar stood over his fallen cousin, breathing hard but victorious. The Thunderhammer still gripped in his hands as proof of his triumph. "It is finished," Aunt Sigrid declared, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The Judgment Stone has witnessed justice done. The rightful leader has reclaimed his place." But even as the crowd began to cheer, everyone understood that this victory was only the beginning. The foreign invaders were still in the settlement, still fighting to complete their conquest. The single combat had determined who would lead the resistance, but the larger battle for freedom was far from over. Ulfar raised the Thunderhammer above his head, its rune-inscribed surface catching the light like a beacon of hope. "People of Ravenshollow," he called out, his voice carrying across the square and beyond. "The traitor is defeated, but our enemies still threaten our homes. Will you follow me to drive them back into the sea?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors who had been uncertain about supporting an exile now rallied to the man who had proven his worth in honorable combat. The sight of Ragnar's defeat and the knowledge that their true leader had returned galvanized the defenders like nothing else could have done. As Ulfar prepared to lead his people into the larger battle, his eyes found Kara in the crowd. She stood watching him with pride and love shining in her face, her own sacrifice evident in the smoke still rising from her destroyed trading post. In that moment, both understood that their false marriage had indeed become something real and precious, a partnership forged in crisis and proven in the crucible of genuine commitment. The Judgment Stone stood witness to their silent exchange, its ancient surface reflecting the truth that had been revealed through trial by combat. Justice had been served, but the fight for their future was just beginning. The Blood Eagle banner unfurled above the market square like a crimson tide against the grey sky, its ancient war symbols catching the wind with fierce dignity. The clan's war banner had not been displayed in over a decade, but today's battle demanded the full weight of tradition and the rallying power of ancestral symbols. As Thorvald hoisted the banner high, its presence transformed the scattered defenders into a unified force ready to fight for their very survival. Ulfar wasted no time in savoring his victory over Ragnar. The sounds of battle from the harbour district grew more intense with each passing moment, and he could see smoke rising from several buildings where the foreign invaders had gained footholds. His people needed him not as a victorious champion, but as a tactical leader who could coordinate their defense effectively. "Thorvald, take 20 men and reinforce the harbour defenses," Ulfar commanded, his voice carrying the natural authority of born leadership. "Don't try to retake the docks, just prevent them from advancing further inland." He turned to another group of fighters. "Eric, lead your men to the eastern approach. If they try to flank us through the farmlands, we need to know immediately." The Thunderhammer felt perfectly balanced in his hands as he planned the defense, its familiar weight giving him confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. The runes inscribed along its handle seemed to pulse with inner fire, as if responding to the desperate need of its wielder and his people. Kara appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot from her burning trading post, but her eyes blazing with determination. "What can I do?" she asked simply. "You've already done more than anyone could ask," Ulfar replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the smoke still rising from her sacrifice. "You bought us precious time and showed everyone what true commitment means." "That's the past," Kara said firmly. "What do you need now?" Before Ulfar could answer, a new commotion arose from the direction of the harbour. But this time the sounds were different, not the clash of weapons, but shouts of confusion and what almost sounded like retreat. The foreign advance had stalled completely, their disciplined formations breaking apart as thick smoke continued to pour from Kara's burning building and several other fires that had been set by quick-thinking defenders. "They're pulling back," Thorvald reported, running up from the harbour district with blood on his sword, but triumph in his eyes. "The smoke has broken their formations, and our people are fighting like demons possessed. They can't maintain their advance without clear sightlines." But Ulfar's expression remained grim as he studied the tactical situation. "They're not retreating, they're regrouping. Professional soldiers don't give up that easily. They'll find another way to attack, probably multiple directions at once." His assessment proved correct within minutes. Horn calls echoed from 3 different directions as the foreign forces split their assault, attacking simultaneously from the harbour, the eastern farmlands, and the forest path that led to the settlement's rear entrance. It was a coordinated assault designed to stretch the defenders too thin to maintain effective resistance at any single point. "They know our weaknesses too well," Aunt Sigrid observed, still wearing the raven feather crown as she watched the developing battle. "Someone has provided them with detailed intelligence about our defenses," the realization that Ragnar's treachery had extended to providing tactical information to the invaders sent a cold fury through the defending warriors. They were not just fighting foreign conquest, but betrayal by one of their own, a violation of trust that made their resistance even more determined. Ulfar made the difficult decision to abandon the outer defenses and concentrate his forces around the market square and Great Hall. It meant giving up ground, but it also meant creating a defensive position they could actually hold with their limited numbers. "Fall back to the center," he commanded, his voice carrying across the settlement. "Make them pay for every step, but don't get cut off from the main force." The fighting retreat was brutal but effective. The defenders used their knowledge of every alley and building to maximum advantage, setting ambushes and creating obstacles that slowed the foreign advance to a crawl. But the invaders were experienced and well-equipped, and their superior numbers began to tell as the defensive perimeter contracted. It was during this phase of the battle that Kara proved her worth as more than just a symbol of sacrifice. Her knowledge of the settlement's layout and her connections with the merchant community allowed her to coordinate supplies and communications in ways that no warrior could have managed. She seemed to be everywhere at once, bringing arrows to archers, carrying messages between defensive positions, and helping wounded fighters reach safety. The final phase of the battle centered on the Great Hall itself, where the last of the defenders had gathered for what might be their final stand. The Blood Eagle banner flew proudly above them, its presence a reminder of all the generations who had fought and died to keep their people free. As the foreign soldiers formed up for their final assault, Ulfar stood before the Great Hall's entrance with the thunder hammer in his hands and his people at his back. Kara stood beside him, no longer pretending to be his wife, but genuinely united with him in purpose and love. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I've never regretted our bargain, not for a single moment." "Nor I," Ulfar replied, reaching out to take her hand. "You have been everything I never dared to hope for." The enemy horns sounded the final charge, and the thunder hammer rose to meet them. 3 months after the smoke had cleared from the great battle, Raven's Hollow hummed with the sounds of rebuilding and renewal. The foreign invaders had been driven back to their ships after their final assault broke against the determined resistance of the defenders. But the victory had come at a cost that would be remembered for generations. The settlement bore scars that would take years to fully heal. Yet there was an energy in the air that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Kara stood in the doorway of her rebuilt trading post, watching the morning bustle with a sense of contentment she had never expected to feel again. The new building was larger than the old one, its construction a community effort that had brought together craftsmen and laborers from across the region. But more than the physical structure, what had been rebuilt was her sense of belonging, her place in a community that valued her not just as a merchant, but as a hero who had sacrificed everything for their freedom. The most significant change, however, was not in the buildings or the bustling commerce, but in the great hall where preparations were underway for a ceremony that would make official what had already become true in the hearts of everyone present. Today, Ulfar and Kara would be married, not in desperation or political necessity, but in love freely chosen and tested by the crucible of shared danger. From a small wooden box on her counter, Kara lifted two simple iron bands that gleamed with the dark beauty of well-worked metal. The new wedding rings had been forged from the steel of Ulfar's father's sword, transformed from an instrument of war into symbols of peace and partnership. The rings represented everything their relationship had become, born of conflict but dedicated to building something lasting and good. "Are you ready?" Ulfar asked from behind her, his voice warm with affection and anticipation. She turned to find him dressed in his finest clothes, the rich blue and silver of clan leadership, replacing the battle-worn garments he had worn for so long. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, eyes that no longer carried the weight of exile and uncertainty, but shone with the confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "I've been ready since the moment you asked me to pretend," she replied, moving into his arms with the natural grace of long familiarity. Though I suspect we both knew even then that there would be nothing pretend about it. They walked together through the settlement toward the great hall, their path lined with people who had gathered to witness the ceremony. These were not just clan members, but representatives from neighboring settlements who had come to honor the couple whose courage had prevented a foreign conquest that would have threatened them all. The story of the false marriage that became true salvation had spread throughout the region, taking on the quality of legend even as the participants remained refreshingly human. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, its rough wooden walls draped with colorful banners and its long tables laden with food and drink. But the most striking change was at the head of the hall, where a new high seat had been carved from oak and ash, its arms decorated with ravens and hammers that proclaimed the restoration of rightful leadership. Aunt Sigrid stood before the high seat, no longer wearing the raven feather crown, but dressed in the ceremonial robes of her office as the clan's spiritual guide. Her face bore the satisfaction of someone who had seen prophecy fulfilled and justice restored, but also the gentle joy of an aunt watching her nephew claim the happiness he deserved. "People of Raven's Hollow," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed hall, "we gather today not just to witness a wedding, but to celebrate the triumph of truth over deception, courage over fear, and love over convenience." The ceremony itself was simple but profound, rooted in traditions that stretched back to the settlement's founding. Ulfar and Kara exchanged vows that spoke not of romantic idealism, but of practical commitment, promises to share burdens as well as joys, to support each other's dreams while building something larger than themselves. When they exchanged the iron rings forged from his father's sword, the symbolism was lost on no one. The weapons of the past had been transformed into the bonds of the future, and the couple who had begun their relationship in desperate fiction now stood united in powerful truth. "What began as strategy has become the foundation of our clan's future," Ulfar said as he placed the ring on Kara's finger. "You have taught me that the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together. And you have shown me that love is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all," Kara replied, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "With this ring, I choose not just you, but the life we will build together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with toasts and stories that wove the new couple's adventure into the larger tapestry of clan history. Children who had been too young to fully understand the recent crisis listened wide-eyed to tales of the giant warrior and the brave merchant who had saved their home through wit and sacrifice. But for Ulfar and Kara, the most meaningful moments came in the quiet spaces between the festivities, stolen conversations by the fire, shared glances across the crowded hall, and the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to communicate without words. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, the couple found themselves alone in the hall that had witnessed so much drama and conflict. The banners hung quietly in the still air, and the fire burned low in the great hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen someone else that night?" Kara asked, settling into Ulfar's arms before the dying fire. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Even if I had known the full cost of what we were beginning, I would have made the same choice. You were the only one brave enough to stand with me when everything seemed lost, and you were the only one worth standing with," she replied, thinking of the wooden horse that still sat on their shelf, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder of the family they hoped to build together. Outside, the settlement slept peacefully under a canopy of stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations. But tonight, they looked down on a people who had reclaimed their destiny through courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that transforms desperate gambles into lasting foundations. The false marriage had indeed become true salvation, just as the prophecy had foretold. And in the morning, Ulfar and Kara would wake to begin the next chapter of their story, not as pretend partners in a political scheme, but as husband and wife building a future worthy of the price they had paid to claim it.